Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So Fresh Red Kills are the videos where I talk about the books that I've recently finished reading. They're kind of like my version of a weekly reads. I don't have regularly scheduled videos. I kind of make them whenever I can or whenever I feel like it. And I'm basically playing catch up. If you're new to my channel, I don't call these necessarily reviews. They're just book discussions. It's just me unscripted, getting my thoughts out on the things that I read. Just kind of keep a record of it. So I'm going to be talking about King Lear and Poe. Both of these I actually read in October. So as usual, I am playing catch up. King Lear, I had actually read the introductory essay in this Arden edition, which I really like these editions. They kind of, probably the most scholarly editions, I guess, that at least I've come across. The introduction is over 100 pages, goes into production history especially. And I read that in September for Shaketember, which is an annual booktube event where people read Shakespeare's plays. And of course, I decided to read this. But I didn't get to the play itself until October. This is actually a reread for me. I had originally read this back in high school. I took a Shakespeare class. It was an elective course. And it was a great experience. The teacher was incredibly laid back. He basically said, we're going to be reading Shakespeare, we're going to be watching adaptations. As long as you're not a nuisance and interrupt us, you'll get an A. That's pretty much how it was. So it was not a rigorous class at all, but really it just allowed us to appreciate. And really nobody was a jerk in that class. Everybody just kind of followed along and, or they were quiet. And this was probably the play that year that most stood out to me, that I most liked. There was the tragedy I certainly was drawn to, some of the humor, which was things that at least I found funny back in high school. Maybe, this time around, maybe not as humorous. Also, the sort of pre-Christian setting, I think I found very, very fascinating. And of course, I'm still somebody who's fascinated by that sort of thing. And I really enjoyed this reread. It's a really tragic story of, I'm not going to get into the details of this king in his old age decides to essentially, split up his kingdom in 3 parts amongst his daughters. But first he wants them to declare, how much they love him. And his first 2 daughters, they basically pour it on thick. But they're not really sincere. And his last daughter, Cordelia, she is more honest. She loves him, but she says, I have to save some of my love for my husband as well, and for my husband-to-be. I can't give you everything. So she's actually more honest, but because of that honesty, he basically takes it as a slight, and he disowns her and kicks her out of the kingdom. And this begins a series of unfortunate events where his other daughters basically strip him of any kind of power that he might have had left. And we have characters going mad. We have a very... an occurring theme of people in disguise, especially those in disguise, dressed as like beggars and insane individuals, and it's just a really good play. I will say that the introduction is good. It certainly had some interesting tidbits. I found this little bit interesting where the author was talking about some of Shakespeare's inspirations for where he was getting this stuff from. And I thought this was kind of neat. He says, another book that seized Shakespeare's imagination when he worked on King Lear was Samuel Harsnet's A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostors from 1603. This polemical attack on the group of Catholic priests who conducted exorcism in private houses was written by the chaplain to the Bishop of London as part of an official campaign against exorcism as practiced both by some Protestants and by Catholics. Harsnet often writes with great verve, and his quirky vocabulary and lively imagery were rated by Shakespeare for his characterization of Edgar as Poor Tom in Act 3. So little things like that, the things that Shakespeare was reading and how it affected the play, I thought were fascinating. The only downside, I think, to this edition is, I think this one was published in like 2020, so it's a fairly recent publication, but the essay, I think, is from the late 90s. So all the productions that it talks about, it doesn't have anything from the past 20 years, unfortunately. I had seen not too long ago, I had watched the Royal Shakespeare Company's production that had Ian McClellan as King Lear, and that was really good. I would have loved to have had some notes on that, and I think that production was, maybe 15 years ago or something. But it's not going to be found in this. So I think that's just one of the major drawbacks, is I think it needs to be updated quite a bit. But otherwise, I'm really glad that I read this. I also read, this is kind of for, Historathon, which is an event that I created where we read nonfiction history, and I think that biography can fall into that category. We are in the fourth quarter of Historathon, and that looks at the years 1820 to the present, so that's Poe's years right there. And Poe is one of those authors that I've always really liked. I've always loved his stories, and I know he was a difficult person, however. Last year I had read the sort of biography. I think it was called A Man of the Crowd, where it looked at the different cities that Poe lived in and how they affected his life and his writing. And this is just a straight biography. And this was published by University Press of Mississippi by James N. Hutchisson. And he wrote this to be a more non-academic biography for the average reader, although I do think it's a little more academic than that. I think that maybe your average Poe reader might have a little bit of difficulty with this, or maybe not as much patience for some of the analysis and those sorts of things. But I think that Hutchisson does a pretty good job here. He goes from Poe's childhood right up to his death. He is not, I would say, blind at all to Poe's faults. He doesn't buy into, some of the more egregious things that were claimed by Poe, or claimed about Poe. But, when Poe messes up, he's very quick to point that out. Poe had this habit of destroying things that were going well for him and burning the bridges along the way. And he even ended up calling it the imp of the perverse. But it fit him to a T. So Poe is somebody who is in some ways brilliant, in other ways incredibly frustrating. He seems like he would have been a very difficult person to be friends with, to be business partners with, just kind of certain arrogance about him. But there was certainly a high intellect and a real gift when it came to writing. And I would say the literary analysis that's found in here is mostly pretty interesting. Occasionally it goes into sort of like Freudian territory, which I'm not a big fan of, but it doesn't do it that often. I did find something kind of interesting when I was looking at Goodreads, and I saw reviews for this, and some of them were really negative. But one person said they only got to like 20 pages or something like that, and gave it like a 1 star. That doesn't count. But another one said that this book claimed that there was an interview given in the 1870s, and he quotes it as, or the reviewer quotes it as Hutchisson saying that the interview was conducted on tape, and the tapes are now inside a museum. And I'm like, I don't remember, by the time I got to the end of this, I don't remember anything about tapes. And it turns out, doing some investigation, that mistake about this interview being on tapes was actually on the audiobook version, which is odd, but it's not in here. So I found the thing that the person was claiming, and it's a section about Elmira Royster Shelton. He says, quote, she was silent on all matters about the author for 26 years. She broke it only in 1875 when she granted an interview to Edward V. Valentine of Richmond. After Elmira's death on 11th February 1888, his notes were placed in the Valentine Museum in Richmond, where they remain today. Now, this definitely says his notes, but for some reason, the audiobook version said that it was a tape and the tapes were placed inside that museum. So that's one of the reasons, I do listen to audiobooks. I don't always talk about the audiobooks on here because the way that I listen to audiobooks is I only listen to audiobooks for things that I have physical copies of. And I go back and forth between the audiobook and the physical copy. So if I'm driving and I'm listening to the audiobook, when I get home, I crack open the book and I start going through those pages. I want to see physically how they look. And I kind of skim through. If there's something that caught my ear that I want to go back to, I read it. And then sometimes I'll read ahead and I'll listen. So I'm kind of like rereading and reading a book at the same time. But I'm glad that, if in that sort of case, that reviewer in Goodreads came away with a very, it seems, inaccurate view of this book based on an error inside of audiobook, something that's not found in the physical copy. So anyhow, there's that. But I'm glad I read it. Poe, I think, is incredibly interesting. And the last thing that I read, I don't have a physical copy of right now because it's at my school. I read Teach Like a Pirate by, I think think it's, I'm trying to remember the author right now. I think it's Dave Burgess. Hopefully I'm remembering that right. But essentially it is a book about teaching. So I'm a middle school teacher, and I'm also, I guess, I'm a team leader, but I guess what you can kind of call like a department head. And I had asked my team if they would, be basically willing to have a book club together. If maybe 3 books a year we kind of read together and we would discuss them, because we understood that even if administration is well-meaning, we can't rely on them to inspire us, to give us new ideas. We have to do that on our own. And they were, my team was very generous in saying, yeah, they wanted to do that. They liked the idea. So the first book that we picked was Teach Like a Pirate. And the author, by that, doesn't mean go pillage your students. He uses pirate as an acronym. And it's a pretty slim book, but essentially he is concerned with the way that material is presented, not with what is presented. I mean, that's of importance too, but just not in the book. So it's about really kind of gathering, your students' attention, and being active inside the classroom. And by doing so, cutting down on things like, students being bored and acting out, by giving them memorable experiences. He is certainly an author with a lot of energy. We all kind of felt like there were certain things in there that we just couldn't really do with our kind of school environment, or the things that are available to us, resources and time. But it certainly gave us a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. And we're thinking about ways that we can maybe take some of the things that were in there and adapt them to ourselves or incorporate it in the classroom. But I'm glad that I read that. And that's all I'm going to talk about for this video. So again, the 3 books that I read, there was Teach Like a Pirate, which I don't have a physical copy of. And we've got King Lear by William Shakespeare, and Poe, a biography by William N. Hutchisson. If you've read any of these, love your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.